wasn't that amazing?
He just likes me.
I like her very much, but she's amazing. I want you all to know several things. One, that story was written in a single night. I mean, I checked to make sure, and it was. This has made people think, because she has this ability to see a story whole and to type it as it occurs as she's watching it, that what Ann Beattie does is easy. And, strangely in our culture, there's a belief that it should be hard. But I think that writing this beautiful and this instinctual should be worshipped, not derogated as easy. Now, somehow, Ann Beattie published just very recently a book called Mrs. Nixon, which people made the mistake, God knows how, of thinking was about Mrs. Nixon. And they reviewed this book and said, this woman knows nothing about Mrs. Nixon. The answer was, neither does anyone else, yes, and that the subject was, how does a writer write a book about someone of whom nothing is known? And how do you build a character and invent her whole cloth and fill her in from the little details you do know? Did anyone say this in a single review? No. Did anyone say it was one of the funniest books to be written in the last 20 or 30 years? No one ever thinks Ann Beattie is funny. So would you applaud again and show that that story was funny? So from time to time I suffer with my friend Ann Beattie about living in a culture that doesn't know how to read and doesn't know how to review books and doesn't know how to accept and allow an artist to have a full life and a full career. I'm talking because I think this is so important, so incredibly important. And now I'll ask my first question, if you'll pardon me. And so tell me, when you do this, I mean, you've described yourself as going and hiding in your room and writing a book about Mrs. Nixon and not telling anybody. I mean, what's going on? Are you getting dictation? Are you, what is it?
No, I would have accepted the dictation. I mean, it would have been a little weird, but it would have gotten written a lot quicker. Really feeling my way into it, not having any idea what any organizing principle was. I spent the year before I started in doing any writing on the book, though, doing research about Mrs. Nixon, because I found out that in reading so many books about her husband, which I did, I got them from the library or wherever I got them, I read a bunch of books about Richard Nixon, and I looked up the footnotes for Mrs. Nixon. And sometimes she would be in the book, but it was so unimportant what they'd said about her, or she had said something so slight that they wouldn't even footnote it. So I found myself reading books that were this thick because I was determined to find the mention of her. So finally, I think it began to occur to me that what was interesting was what Michael just said, someone about whom very little was known, but that really I kept seeing her because of my reading. And sometimes I was reading Life magazine. Sometimes I was looking at photographs of her. Sometimes I was looking at the Nixon coloring book. Do you remember that series of coloring books that were illustrated? Many, the Queen of England and Prince Philip, all that, that sort of thing. I was thinking about Mrs. Nixon in context, and I was thinking, as a writer, what do those contexts mean to me? What do they indicate to me? So that often I found myself actually thinking of other literary texts to use as example. So all of that became a springboard into discussing, say, stories by Donald Barthelme or something like that.
It's kind of an amazing book, and they have it in the lobby, and because you would be, indicating that you have interest in a writer whose book was given to historians to review, oh, this isn't the Mrs. Nixon we know of. So why not pick it up and read a truly strange book, as I think that second story is truly strange. You don't expect, when this child is being taken to a party, that Cher is going to be the first thing seen, and then Elvis Costello, and then you stop and think, oh, these are all sort of people still famous, but no longer at the center of the culture. In a certain sense, this small-town girl becomes a version of the writer we're talking to. Once iconic, now an even greater writer than when she began. But what do you do in America after you begin? You what? Have a birthday party for the children. You take on a new lover who's nominated for the Academy Award. You build a new studio. Everything needs to be new. Now, Anne told me then that I was just being Michael Silverblatt. That yes, this was what the story was about, but that none of it was in her mind. Now, how do you do that?
I hang out with you and you explain to me what I'm writing. But it's very, very interesting what writers review. Of course it is. I mean, it's extremely interesting. I teach one semester a year at the University of Virginia, and I don't do it as a parlor trick, but every now and then when I'm talking to a student about his or her manuscript, I say, here's the story right here in this line. It sounds good, but it's really a wrong line, and this is exactly where you start to hide. You never stop hiding. It's literature, but it's not the story. So I sometimes have the ability to see things the way Michael does, but I'd never have Michael's sort of overarching intelligence about, I don't know, the guy kind of, no, sincerely, like the vulnerability that's expressed that I certainly would cover up myself if I knew it was in the story at that level. I can't not grant your point, but that's kind of horrifying to know that that's that transparent to Michael,
Well, you see, it's an interesting kind of thing because I think that writing a beautiful story now, where all of the meaning is never stated, is as rare as being able to read one. And I think that that's why we're both here, Anne and I, because I think that without it, life grows more meaningless. That's what I was trying to say about resonance. This story doesn't have a meaning, it has a resonance. And you get the chill from it, whether you've made the association or not. Now, you've pointed out, as Hemingway has pointed out, that the most important events in a short story happen off the page. Now, again, when you're writing, do you know what those events are that are off the page?
Well, I know in substance what those events are that are off the page. I don't often know in particular, and it's the particulars that can, in a good way, trip me up some of the time. For example, when I was writing In the White Knight, I didn't know until the minute I wrote the sentence that anyone's child had died. I mean, I knew that something was going to happen between the two couples. I knew there was some tone and subtext to the marriage. I mean, I probably could have stopped writing and introspected about that, but the sentence just seemed to write itself, and then I thought, of course, that's what this sentence is about. And also just things then click back in that are very useful. I don't know if they're very vivid to the reader, but I certainly wasn't about to die of it, but I did have serious surgery when I was a child, and one of my most vivid memories of my father, who was a big man, 6'2", was even as a child I felt this, how really awkward he looked sitting in this little hospital bed, and he must have been scared to death with these stupid pastel animals, but I would never have remembered that. That's not inherently terribly dramatic, but I don't have to make anything up. I mean, once I start to remember, the particulars can actually be taken from life.
You know, as you were reading, I got to read A Small Town Girl Thinks About the Moon on the airplane on the way here, and I was laughing out loud. I just thought It was astonishing. And, of course, it's melancholy too, and deranged, and that, cell phone that gets dropped off the pier is the unmoved mover of the story. Something has happened. I assume Kay doesn't know what it is, but he's dropped his cell phone off the pier. It's a cliched gesture, one that a bad actor would make, probably like Mrs. Norman Maine in A Star is Born, who walked into the ocean. But now we just drop our cell phone in. And, she communicates to him through his secretary. He knows his interest in her is her ability to introduce him to an actor he's admired, that she could bring him to this party, but she might not otherwise see him for several days. And she's murmuring and giving herself pep talks. I love him, I love him, I love him, because, otherwise, what is she? What has she been doing? And wow, in a hilarious story, to have as its subtext nothing at all funny is an act of genius. I mean, I just am so...
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's disconcerting, but it's disconcerting for the writer too, to understand that that's what it is, and never to be able to address it or bring it up to the surface level of the story. You lose it instantly if you do that. Of course you do. But I think, everybody, in retrospect, I can say things about the story that I didn't feel in the moment, but, I do like William Wegman's photographs a lot. I think everybody does, I think. I mean, they're just terrific. But the idea of everything being costumed, even the animals, that it's not just laughter, ha-ha, that it really says something about the way we're recast by others that we can't do anything about. And that certainly, by the way, was true of Mrs. Nixon, too. Mrs. Nixon was not in control of the idiotic prose that was directed her way when people gave, a report of one of her trips to Africa or something like that.
Now, I notice, I've felt this for as long as I've been reading you, that these events off the page are signaled by the nimbuses of light, almost as if the scene is seen with spectral things, apparitions. They are seen as light, and their presence is the signal that something more is off. And I think of F. Scott Fitzgerald as being the great stage lighter of stories and novels. Do you think about lighting? Do you remember the lighting of events? Because they're so beautifully rendered in the stories.
Yeah, well, I have a very strong visual sense, and the more I look at something, the more I see the visual detail of it. But like everybody else, I sort of am overwhelmed in the moment of figuring out where to locate something, and I know generally what it looks like, but then it seems to particularize itself to me almost as though certain things are spotlit. I didn't know that I would use her fingers on the mirror, that she would come back in and see that that mark was still there. But, another part of my brain that isn't the part of the brain creating the story, wanting to know as little as possible, when I saw them later, I knew if I hit it one more time that it would be spotlit moons of a different sort. That's what she touches instead of touching him. She touches the mirror. She doesn't touch anything.
And she tells herself to have a different feeling than the one that would be obvious. Touch the mirror and let the fingers feel the surface. Don't look at yourself in the mirror. That would be acting.
Yeah.
Feel your fingers touching the surface of the mirror instead. Now, doesn't this make it nearly, therefore, impossible to rewrite a story if you know that how to do it is not to know too much? And the story has to be composed out of dozens and dozens and dozens of specific detail, as long as you, one, don't know what they mean, and two, don't mean anything that someone would guess they mean in the cliched version.
Yes. No, I understand entirely what's being said there. And you know, with Fitzgerald, when he's writing narrative, it's just plain so vivid that I don't know that it's haunting things. I mean, they're haunting images, the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg, and eyes reappear throughout The Great Gatsby, and so on and so forth. You can certainly follow the motif of them, but I wonder too if there wasn't a very simple sense of him being overwhelmed by these things, like what billboards look like when they're put up. I mean, it grabs our attention all the time. That's really, truly in our faces. The smaller things, once you hear something, it connects. And you think, oh yeah, it is interesting to know what people's bathroom mirrors look like, and whether you reach out for them or something like that. So you have to have a certain level of dumbness too.
Well, now,
just to grab something,
Well, now you see, this is the point where, inevitably there's something about a writer that makes me cry, and just is. I mean, it's my nature. And I have a friend who's been teaching literature to disturbed children. He was teaching Great Gatsby. And I said to him, well, no matter what you do me a favor, don't tell him that it's about greed and all that stuff that everyone always says. Because if you think about it for a second, Fitzgerald didn't know it was about greed. He was in love with riches. He couldn't resist them. He was crazy about everything in that novel, from the saxophones and the spotlight blowing petals around the floor. I mean, where do you get that from? It's not greed. It's his incredible lust for thing after thing after thing, and putting a nimbus around it and making it more and more beautiful. And I said, remember, please understand, this is, in literature, one of the first traffic accidents that cars were new. Yeah. Billboards were new. There weren't billboards lining the highway yet. Of course you looked up to see the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg, and so are the descriptions of the cars. We didn't have advertisements yet telling us that our cars were speeding Mustangs and clumping over. He's writing the first advertising copy for the automobile and why we love the automobile, and he's writing it in a novel, and it's all want, 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 and please don't do that thing that makes a novel boring in school, because you see, readers want these things too. They don't want a lesson in greed. They know greed is bad. They've been being told that since childhood. So how do you write? This microphone is falling from my ear, but if I keep my hand up to my ear, I'll
someone
hold it
will
in
rush
place.
forward, I feel sure.
They'll rush from the wing. Rush from the wing, please. And I'm asking such an interesting question. Oh, good. That was in a real thank you. I love you both. Okay, so the things that the teacher knows, the writer has to not know.
Yeah.
And the writer becomes a teacher now. Everywhere you go, there's a school with a writer in it, with the writer in front of the classroom, trying to teach the student not how to know, but what Donald Barthelme called not knowing. Schools are places where knowledge is made too obvious. Writing is a place where knowledge is avoided, withheld, neglected. So what do you do with these kids? Because their other classes are teaching them, if only, how to misread novels or how to talk about Rita Hayworth as icon, or, how do you teach the ignorance needed to make something shimmer with resonance?
I don't think I can. I mean, I don't think I'm skillful enough to do that. I don't think I can decondition people who have become inhibited about what those things are. What I always say to the writing students, I also teach literature, but when I'm talking to the writing students, I always say, your rough drafts can be really, really messy. You can do the craziest things. No one sees them. Please don't bring them forward either. I mean, you don't need to prove to me that you've written 6 drafts of this. If you tell me, then I believe you've written 6 drafts of this. But, I'm worried that what gets institutionalized is that there has to be an inherent logic to something, and you have to be a literary person with all that means. And what that means is even the first thing out isn't dumb enough to really contain power.
Mm-hmm. But I'd like to suggest to all of you in the audience that you will remember the microphone falling from my ear long after you'll remember anything else. In other words, the significant detail is always the unexpected one, and the loss of control is the place where the thing comes to life.
Yeah. I mean, really, there are these wonderful little moments when sometimes when you're reading, especially when you're reading a text for the first time, right, you feel like, the author's losing it, it's going out of control, only to bring it back into control, but to have made you blink, in effect. And I don't doubt that the author blinked in that moment, too. I don't doubt that sometimes when you falter, you want to leave those things in. I mean, we all love, what certain carpets look like, but the more we look and the more we see the irregularities of them, that kind of puts us at ease, too. They're so amazing, and yet there are those irregularities. So I don't know. I mean, I certainly have a feeling for that. You read somebody who's very, very careful, but not calculating. I've been reading Alice Munro lately. That's what I was reading on the plane coming out here. And Alice Munro is looking at that really kind of mad, much more mad than William Morris wallpaper, because you see this level and this level and this level, and you see how everything refers to everything else. And I don't know how she does it. I mean, to me, that absolutely is genius, too. Everything's there, in the same moment of time. And then you look at it even longer, and you realize it's so dazzling, you missed it completely, and this whole story is a rewrite of a dialogue she's having with Virginia Woolf. And in fact, that happened to me. I was reading a story by Alice Munro called Post and Beam. I've read it many, many times. I can tell you, what the language is doing. I can tell you what a lot of those dimensions are doing. And I put my head in my hands. I mean, I was both delighted but just dismayed. It's so hard to read well. It is an art. And I thought, I can't even believe it. I mean, when the characters here are filling with the hose the little swimming pool, and Alice Munro is giving a paraphrase of the scene, the paraphrase she gives of her scene, which is perfectly adequate, I mean, it's well paraphrased, is how you would describe to the lighthouse in a paragraph. Wow. And here it's this swimming pool with a hose, and the kid is, dancing naked and splashing her feet in the pool. And I thought, how many times have I read this and not realized she's in dialogue with Virginia Woolf? Wow. But you know what I mean? It's instead of a veil falling or something, it's it just gets taken up.
Yeah, no. Wow. And it's amazing, but that's when you feel this, for me, when I have those I feel like this strange gratitude that literature exists, that I've read it, that I've been given the grace to have this moment, because this is what writers do. And, the other stuff, there were 3 sheep in that meadow, and there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Almost never is that what was on the writer's mind. Really. But almost always, when you begin to recognize a certain tone of voice, it's almost as if the writing enters a trance in which the writer is speaking to her dream of a hero. Virginia Woolf or whoever it might be.
It is like a trance. Exactly what it's like.
And I think that the writer feels as grateful to enter that place of having someone to talk to, because writing is so solitary. The only thing as solitary as writing is, guess what? Reading. And, so that when you as a reader have come to that point where you say, oh my God, yeah, she's in the dialogue with Virginia Woolf, and you know it, know being a word here like resonance, know it's not a fact, but you know inside that a writer like Alice Munro would have to be being, from time to time, in dialogue with Virginia Woolf. Who else would she be able to speak to at a moment like that, just as some of us who aren't writers enter conversations with our parents during those off moments of life when we need reassurance, a writer needs to hear from mentors who've never been met in other ways.
Yeah. Well, I do that a little bit in a very different way in Mrs. Nixon. I mean, it's also seemed to me as an outsider, I don't know this firsthand, but just the idea of what you can do moving a camera around something and how it's going to be. Well, my husband sculpts and really has an eye, and the minute he sees a piece of sculpture he's drawn to, he starts walking around it. I'm just sort of, do I like that or do I not like that? What is it? What's going on there? It's that going around it. It's that inherent motion of the thing that you have to get. And, there are a lot of writers that I admire who do that, and we've talked a lot about Donald Barthelme, and isn't that what he did? I mean, a retake, I'll move around, I'll get it from this angle, I'll write an entire story like The Balloon that's a send-up, and the last paragraph will be, well, when you return from whatever it is, Norway, or not Norway, but, whatever. And suddenly it's terribly, it's come down to that little funnel point, and that he admits, he shows his hand. I tried not to show my hand in Mrs. Nixon, but look what it got me.
Well, it's very interesting because as you're reading Mrs. Nixon, right, suddenly you get to these chapters where, what if I were a modern novelist, a member of the Oulipo, writing about Mrs. Nixon? Now, the Oulipo are a bunch of French writers who have these screwy rules, like I'm going to write this whole novel without the letter E. And so suddenly she does the Oulipo version of Mrs. Nixon, and how very nice. This is yet another option. And you do get this touching portrait of a woman whose husband will not pay her the attention that she doesn't insist upon. And it is a contemporary woman, and Ann Beattie has done it again and again. She goes out shoe shopping with her own mother, and you feel this. I mean, I don't know if it's preternatural or not, but the mother in the department store in Washington is your mother.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And you just, as a reader, you can feel this. And in walks Mrs. Nixon, also buying shoes. And Mrs. Nixon leans across and, you should buy those. They're really very pretty. And you just feel, this must have happened until, wait, it can't, it's too perfect. And 3 pages later, Anne says, in this huge sidelong wing, I just made that up. That didn't happen. And then she says something truer still, then you no longer have any basis for judgment. Okay, I'm going to announce that is the methodology of a novel. Deprive the reader of a basis for judgment as you subject the reader to more and more realistic things that could not have happened. That's what a novel is. When we went through periods of novelist hallucination and this and that there should be this, meta-novel by Ann Beattie. You see, they were so sure that they knew what Ann Beattie does, so it couldn't have been a meta-novel, a novel about writing, and how do you build a character? Everyone will ask that at a writing program when Ann Beattie appears. How do you build a character? So Ann Beattie took a whole book to answer that question, and no one heard the answer, or at least no critic, no reviewer. It amazes me And it is a book that will make you laugh out loud and then will make you feel very, very sad because he was more willing to pay attention to goddamn checkers than to Pat Nixon. And what loneliness. And those daughters and their view of their mother and how did they get raised and how was she feeling at those marriages? And all, I see Aunt Beattie's sparkling eyes at night by the computer, seeing what happens to a woman who's deprived of her nature by the course of history. And what a book! I mean, what an astonishing book to have written. And how many layers are there in that? And then, you see, and that's my last question, how, having done something profound and crazy and interesting, how do you withstand it not being understood?
Well, I'm not always as even-tempered as I am right now, and I don't, it would be great if I could just completely internalize your voice. It's a great consolation, for one thing. I don't really. I mean, I don't know that it puts me in a very good mood or makes me feel very good about the act of writing and so forth, but I'm not just saying this. I talk to so many people, not just my personal friends, who do have some intimations of what it's supposed to be. In other words, I have friends who are historians. They don't mistake it for being a historical document that's not as well, that's esoterically researched. I mean, honestly, that's what the review said in the New York Times. I despair for the culture. It's not just the individual book, and that maybe it makes it less painful. I think, wow, imagine, what else they can't read.
I want to thank you all. It's always an extraordinary pleasure to be in Santa Fe. I want to say, maybe it's easier to say in the absence tonight of Patrick Lannon, how much he and his foundation has meant to me for these many, many years. This, for me, was the most exciting night of all, because usually I'm here scared stiff because they've chosen yet another writer who I'm meeting and talking to for the first time, and it makes me want to lose my cookies, But tonight I got to talk to a dear, dear friend, and it's an honor to talk to her in front of you.
Oh,
thank you very much.
Thank you.